Paul from Paul Tant Economics Tutoring, and today we'll be talking about one of the most, probably the most fundamental and important concept in economics, demand and supply. Now, the reason that demand and supply is so important because economics is a science of allocation of scarce resources, right? And it's scarce because on the supply side, we can only supply a finite number of goods. On the demand side, we have unlimited wants of things, right? I want unlimited amount of cars. I want unlimited amount of houses. So because it is a problem of limited supply versus unlimited demand, we have to come up with a solution, right, to address this. And the solution will be your supply and demand. On the right, you can see this supply and demand graph, which you've probably seen before. Every supply and demand graph looks roughly similar. It always consists of a demand curve. And the demand curve is always downward sloping, meaning that it's always going down. And the reason for this is simple. For something that is cheaper, you will want more, right? Say, iPhone, if iPhone's cheaper, then I would love to buy more, right? If a car is cheaper, I would love to buy more. By the same logic, if iPhone becomes a lot more expensive, then people tend to buy less. Here we're talking about the aggregate level, so the society's total demand level, right? So, and then there's also the supply curve, right? And supply curve is always upward sloping. And the reason it is upward sloping is because the higher the price something is, the more suppliers are willing to produce it, right? So if, say, the higher the price of iPhone is, the more willing Apple will be to produce it because it will be making a bigger profit, right? That's why demand will be always downward sloping and supply is always upward sloping. And you can see there's always a point that they cross. And this point will be what you call a equilibrium, right? Equilibrium then is when actual transactions happen. So at this price point, this amount of quantity is both produced and demanded, right? Say what if you go above this point? Well, say if you're at a price level that's above the current price, then you have more supply and less demand, right? So you have oversupplied. And in that case, then producers will see their products not being sold. So they will reduce the price of their products. And as they reduce their price of products, right, demand increases. And finally, they meet here. And by the same logic, if current price is below price P, right, somewhere here, then you have more demand and less supply. So there's an over demand of the product. In that case, what will consumers do? Well, they will be willing to pay higher price, right? Suppliers, as consumers pay higher price, then suppliers are incentivized to produce more. So they finally meet at PQ. Okay, so that's your equilibrium. And this is a very, very important concept in economics because one thing that I want you to take away is that in every supply and demand curve, there's always an equilibrium, right? And your job very often in exams or assignments is to find the equilibrium or find or identify the movement in equilibrium due to a movement in curves. Now, when we talk about movements, there are two types of movements. One is a movement along the curve, and the other one is a parallel shift of the curve. A movement along the curve is due to internal forces, meaning that it's internal to the price and quantity mix, right? So higher price, higher quantity, lower price, lower quantity, and you move along the supply curve. For demand curve, higher price, lower quantity, lower price, higher quantity, and you move along the demand curve, right? The second type of movement will be a parallel shift of the curve, which I have examples as here, right? So on the left, you can see a parallel shift of the supply curve. And this will be due to something external. For example, suppliers, they set up a new factory. For example, there is a tax cut on the suppliers, and they are now willing to produce more at every price point. Yeah, because it is external, it applies to every price point, right? So you see a shift in supply. And your equilibrium naturally goes from your old equilibrium, which is here, to a new equilibrium, which is here. On the right-hand side, you have a case of left shift, so a decrease in supply at every price level, right? So you go from old equilibrium here to a new equilibrium here. And same thing could happen to with demand, right? Demand can also increase or decrease due to external factors. For example, one of the most classical example would be tax, right? If you tax people less, they're willing to spend more in general because they have more disposable income, right? So you have a rightward shift of the demand curve. Now, to recap, demand curve is always downward sloping, and supply curve is always upward sloping. You can either have a movement along the curve, right? That is due to internal changes in price and quantity. Or you can have a parallel shift of the curve that is due to any sort of external forces. For example, setting up a new factory, tax, government spending, etc., consumer taste. And every market has the equilibrium, right? It doesn't matter how demand curve and supply curve shifts, it will always have a equilibrium. And your job very often will be to find that equilibrium and explain that equilibrium. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.